January 1943. North Atlantic. Depth, 180 meters. Batteries fading. Silence absolute. Inside the steel hull of U-Boat U-553, the air is thick with diesel residue and the sour smell of men who have been submerged far too long. Condensation drips from overhead pipes, tapping softly onto the metal deck plates. Every sound feels amplified in the crushing quiet. The crew stands motionless at their stations, eyes fixed on the gauges, listening for something, anything, that might tell them whether the destroyer above has lost their trail. Then it comes. A single, sharp ping slices through the dark water like a blade of sound. Clean, metallic, inescapable. The men freeze. No one breathes. The hull vibrates faintly as the echo rolls along its riveted frame. They know what this means. The enemy has found their depth or is searching dangerously close to it. Another ping, louder this time. It reverberates across the control room, crawling down the length of the submarine like a cold finger. For U-boat crews, this sound will soon define the war. An acoustic signal that the age of the hunter is ending, and a new era of being hunted has begun. The Battle of the Atlantic did not begin with sonar pings or destroyer hunt groups. It began with confidence, German confidence. When war erupted in September 1939, the Kriegsmarine possessed only a fraction of the naval power of Britain, but it held something far more dangerous, a doctrine shaped by stealth, patience, and the cold mathematics of attrition. Admiral Karl Donitz's U-boat arm believed that a small but coordinated fleet of submarines could strangle Britain's supply lines and force the island nation into submission long before the Allies could organize a meaningful countermeasure. During those early months, the ocean seemed open and forgiving. The North Atlantic was vast, dark, and full of places to hide. U-boats operated on the surface at night, gliding like shadows across the waves. Their diesel engines hummed as they maneuvered into position, waiting for convoys to cross their path. Once contact was made, Wolfpack tactics took over. One submarine signaled the presence of ships, others converged. Torpedoes streaked through the water. Merchant ships erupted in flames. Survivors, if there were any, clung to drifting debris as the U-boats submerged again, slipping away before escorts arrived. These were the happy times for German submariners, a misleading name, but accurate in the sense that the U-boat force inflicted immense damage with minimal losses. In 1940 alone, more than 1,000 Allied ships were sunk. Britain faced a mathematical catastrophe. Merchant losses outpaced ship production. Every torpedo hit meant fewer tons of fuel, food, weapons, and raw materials reaching ports like Liverpool, Glasgow, or Cardiff. If the lifeline across the Atlantic snapped, Britain could not continue fighting. This looming threat forced the British Admiralty into a frantic search for solutions. Radar, code-breaking, long-range aircraft, new escort formations, all were considered, tested, and proved. One technology, however, emerged as the foundation for any hope of countering the U-boats. ASTIC, the early form of sonar. It had been in development since World War I, a product of British and French scientific cooperation, but it was still rudimentary and limited. ASTIC emitted a pulse of sound that traveled through water, struck an underwater object, and returned as an echo. In theory, it could locate a submarine. In practice, it was unreliable in rough seas, could only detect targets ahead of a moving ship, and struggled with U-boats that skillfully maneuvered below temperature layers or at sharp angles. Still, it offered something no other tool could, a way to break the silence of the deep. German commanders understood the existence of ASTIC, but they dismissed it as inconsistent and easily evaded. They knew its limitations and designed tactics around them, darting beneath escorts, hiding below thermoclines, or remaining motionless on the seafloor. Many captains believed that if they were careful, patient, and lucky, sonar would remain nothing more than background noise, a distant experiment that could not turn the tide. For a time, they were right. But war accelerates innovation. Every U-boat attack forced the Allies to refine their defenses. Every sinking added urgency to the work in British research labs and naval test ranges. Engineers pushed for stronger transmitters, sharper receivers, and more stable frequencies. They experimented with new attack doctrines, coordinated patterns of destroyers sweeping the ocean with synchronized sonar beams. Meanwhile, the ocean itself became a different kind of battlefield. Convoys grew larger. Escorts became more numerous. Aircraft from Iceland and Newfoundland extended their range. The waters that once felt infinite began to tighten around the U-boats. By late 1941, the German advantage began to erode. Torpedo failures frustrated captains. Allied code-breaking subtly shifted convoy routes. Hunting became more dangerous than ever before. And beneath all of this, a quiet transformation was underway, one the German crews could not yet hear, but would soon feel in every vibrating bolt of their steel hulls. Because the Allies were learning not just to detect U-boats, but to trap them. A shift that would soon be felt in every submarine, where the once laughed-at sonar ping would become a signal of fear. By early 1942, the confident rhythm of the U-boat campaign pulsed at its peak. Germany believed the Atlantic was still theirs to dominate. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, Donitz saw opportunity, not danger. He dispatched his submarines to the American coastline, where inadequate coastal blackouts and unescorted shipping created a deadly hunting ground. Tankers burned against the night sky, and U-boat crews felt invincible again. This period, later called the Second Happy Time, gave the illusion that German submarines remained untouchable. But illusions fade quickly in war. Even as merchant ships fell, Allied laboratories and naval commands were undergoing a fundamental shift in thinking. Britain had already invested years into improving ASTIC. Now, with American industrial scale behind the effort, sonar entered a new phase of capability. Transmitters became stronger. Receivers became more sensitive. Operators received better training, learning to interpret faint returns, distinguish submarine signatures from biological noise, and coordinate attack patterns with precision. More importantly, Allied strategy evolved. The idea of a single escort chasing a submarine was obsolete. Instead, escort groups formed tight, disciplined teams of destroyers, corvettes, and frigates that operated like a hunting pack. One ship held sonar contact. Others maneuvered into flanking positions. Depth charges were deployed in pre-planned patterns that boxed the U-boat into narrow escape corridors. What had once been a duel became a systematic hunt. Meanwhile, technology on the surface was connecting with technology above. Long-range aircraft, Catalinas, Liberators, Sunderlands, slowly began to close the mid-Atlantic gap, the vast stretch of ocean where air cover had previously been impossible. Even a single aircraft forced U-boats down during daylight, draining batteries and limiting oxygen. A submerged U-boat was slower, weaker, and almost blind. And, critically, it was vulnerable to sonar. German captains quickly realized that their assumptions about ASTIC were outdated. They had believed thermoclines, layers of water with different temperatures, could shield them from detection. But newer sonar systems, especially those used by American destroyer escorts, had greater penetration and could track submarines through moderate thermal layers. Even evasive maneuvers, once considered reliable, became predictable. Experienced sonar operators learned to anticipate U-boat zigzags and adjust their beams accordingly. The more the Allies adapted, the clearer the shift became. And under the surface, German engineering constraints grew more obvious. A U-boat's batteries allowed only limited submerged endurance. If forced down by aircraft and held underwater by sonar-equipped escorts, crews faced suffocating heat, rising carbon dioxide, failing lights, and dwindling power. Every minute submerged drained life from the machine and from the men inside. German hydrophones, once effective passive listening tools, could not compete with the sharp, echoing precision of Allied active sonar. Still, some officers clung to outdated confidence. They viewed sonar as a nuisance, a tool that guided escorts but could be outmaneuvered with skill. Yet reports from the front began to contradict this belief. Boats that once returned proudly now limped into port battered, shaken, with stories of relentless sonar contact lasting hours. By mid-1942, the Kriegsmarine High Command could no longer ignore the trend. They received increasingly frequent reports of U-boats pinned underwater, hunted for entire nights, their hulls creaking under pressure, their crews exhausted and terrified. The attackers were faster, more coordinated, and increasingly precise. But the psychological dimension was perhaps the most devastating shift. German U-boat sailors began to recognize the sound of the sonar ping not as a distant curiosity, but as a signal of impending destruction. The metallic pulse cut through steel, bone, and nerve. It was a sound that ignored darkness, distance, and careful silence. It meant someone above knew, or was close to knowing, exactly where they were. This transformation in the Atlantic War was not sudden. It was a gradual tightening, a steady improvement in Allied detection and attack capability that reshaped the balance of power. By late 1942, the U-boats were no longer the undisputed hunters of the ocean. They were targets in a rapidly evolving technological battle, one where each innovation in sonar pushed them further from dominance and closer to vulnerability. And as 1943 approached, the meaning of that echoing ping would change forever, setting the stage for the angles that defined a U-boat experience in the darkest months of the war. By 1943, the Allies no longer viewed sonar as a mere detection tool. It had evolved into the centerpiece of a coordinated anti-submarine doctrine. British and American escort groups transformed their approach from reactive defense to proactive hunting, combining sonar precision with disciplined teamwork. Escorts were no longer scattered protectors. They were organized into compact, cooperative units trained to maintain formation and share information seamlessly. A typical escort group comprised destroyers, corvettes, and frigates, each assigned a specific role. One vessel maintained active sonar contact, sweeping a narrow cone through the water to hold the U-boat's approximate position. A second vessel maneuvered silently into an attack vector. A third prepared to cut off escape routes. Meanwhile, aircraft overhead kept submarines submerged during daylight hours, ensuring batteries drained faster and U-boats entered engagements already disadvantaged. The creeping attack became the signature tactic of Allied escorts. While one ship, usually the leader, held steady sonar contact, another vessel moved at extremely slow speed, following hand signals or radio silence to avoid being detected. This second ship then released depth charges directly onto the U-boat's projected path. Because sonar pinpointed approximate depth and distance, the attack had devastating accuracy. The Americans complemented this with a Hedgehog forward-throwing mortar. Unlike depth charges, which exploded at preset depths, Hedgehog bombs detonated only on contact. They created a curtain of explosive spheres in front of the escort, ideal for moments when sonar confirmed a U-boat's path. Allied doctrine became a choreography of noise and silence, of pressure and patience. Sonar kept the submarine fixed in a narrow underwater corridor. Escort ships squeezed that corridor until escape became nearly impossible. The U-boat no longer dictated the battlefield. The escort group did. 4 German crews. Every ping symbolized a coordinated machine working above them, one that grew stronger and more precise with each passing month. The mythology surrounding U-boats often paints them as fearsome underwater predators. In truth, they were fragile machines shaped by the engineering constraints of their era. Their hulls, though strong, had depth limits. Their batteries provided only a few hours of high-speed submerged travel. Their air purity deteriorated rapidly when forced to remain deep, and their electric motors produced detectable noise when pushed too hard. When sonar matured, these limitations became deadly. A U-boat diving to evade detection consumed enormous battery power. A sustained depth of more than 150 to 200 meters strained the hull. Insufficient electrical reserves meant dimming lights, slower pumps, failing equipment, and rising humidity that condensed into dripping sheets along the bulkheads. The deeper a submarine went, The more every creak and groan reminded sailors of physics they could not cheat. Moreover, German submarines lacked an effective acoustic countermeasure in the early years. Bold experiments, such as rubber coatings designed to absorb sonar, proved insufficient. Ultimately, the U-boat was a product of 1930s engineering trying to withstand 1940s innovations. Even Type 7 and Type 9 boats, the backbone of the U-boat fleet, were conceived before sonar became a decisive factor. They were designed for surface attack and short submerged escapes, not prolonged underwater endurance. When escorts forced them deep and held them there with persistent sonar beams, the engineering gap became brutally clear. Submarines that could not outlast the barrage had only two options: surface and fight hopelessly with deck guns, or accept destruction below. This mechanical vulnerability intensified the psychological stress within each hull. A U-boat crew did not fear merely the sound of sonar. They feared their own machine's limitations, which sonar exposed without mercy. By mid-war, the U-boat arm experienced something deeper than tactical or technological defeat. It faced emotional collapse. The sailors who entered the service often did so with pride. They believed in stealth warfare, in a romantic image of submariners as elite hunters beneath the waves. Training schools reinforced this identity, emphasizing precision, teamwork, and endurance. But sonar shattered that image. Young sailors, some barely 20 years old, found themselves trapped in steel tubes for days at a time, hunted by unseen enemies above. They heard the ping reverberate through every beam and rivet. They waited for depth charges to explode, sometimes minutes apart, sometimes with an agonizing silence in between. They endured rising carbon dioxide that made breathing difficult and thinking foggy. They watched officers calculate battery reserves and hull stress with trembling hands. Many realized that their survival depended less on skill and more on whether the enemy made a miscalculation. Word spread among U-boat crews about increasing losses. Sailors wrote in diaries, were allowed, that morale was sinking. Letters home, censored but revealing in tone, spoke of uncertainty and dread. By 1943, U-boats leaving port were seen off by crowds who understood that most would never return. Loss rates exceeded 70%, some of the highest of any military branch in the war. The sonar ping became a symbol of this emotional descent. It represented a technological shift, yes, but more importantly, it represented the inversion of identity. U-boat crews were no longer feared predators. They were men trapped in darkness, hoping their hull would survive one more pattern of depth charges. This emotional dimension shaped the final years of the Atlantic conflict, influencing decisions, outcomes, and the increasingly desperate actions of commanders. The turning point in the underwater war did not arrive with a single battle, but the events surrounding Convoy ONS-5 in late April and early May 1943 offered a concentrated glimpse of the shift that had been building for months. It became a moment when German U-boat commanders realized, often too late, that the balance of the Atlantic had reversed. Sonar, escort doctrine, long-range aircraft, and refined tactics all converged to expose the submarine force's vulnerabilities with brutal clarity. Convoy ONS-5 sailed westbound from Liverpool toward Halifax, a slow-moving column of merchant ships carrying essential supplies. Its escorts included destroyers, corvettes, and newly introduced frigates, vessels equipped with modern sonar and trained in coordinated attacks. For Donitz, still convinced of U-boat superiority, this convoy represented an opportunity. He dispatched multiple wolf packs, Mise, Star, and Specht, to intercept it. Nearly 50 German submarines converged on the North Atlantic, expecting another victory. But the ocean had changed. A deadly mix of fog, rough seas, and unpredictable winds disrupted German coordination. More importantly, Allied escorts now operated with a confidence and precision unseen earlier in the war. Sonar operators aboard HMS Duncan, HMS Vedette, and several corvettes stood ready with improved ASTIC sets, capable of detecting submarines at deeper ranges. They had trained for weeks in interpreting faint echoes, distinguishing thermal layer distortions from real contacts, and passing information rapidly through escort channels. On the night of April 29th, U-boat U-650 attempted to slip beneath the convoy's flank, expecting darkness to conceal its approach. But sonar aboard the British corvette HMS Loosestrife caught a faint return, an irregular echo shifting slightly across bearings. Operators recognized the signature instantly. A slow-moving submarine altering course. The destroyer HMS Orby joined the contact, establishing a triangulation that trapped U-650 in an increasingly narrow corridor beneath the convoy. Below the surface, the U-boat's crew felt the first ping. Soft but unmistakable. The captain ordered a silent turn. Electric motors whirred quietly. Hydrophone operators strained to identify escort propellers. But every maneuver produced another ping, louder and sharper. The escorts were not guessing, they were tracking. Loosestrife executed a creeping attack, maintaining sonar contact at low speed. Orby closed from another angle. At 2:15, a barrage of depth charges detonated above U-650. The pressure wave slammed through the hull, extinguishing lights and knocking crewmen from their stations. Bolts rattled. Pipes hissed. The submarine plunged deeper before stabilizing. Their batteries drained faster as they attempted evasive patterns, but sonar held them in place like a predator circling wounded prey. Above, the convoy pressed onward, escorted by ships that understood the battlefield better than the wolf packs hunting them. Further engagements followed. On May 4th, HMS Vedette made 5 separate sonar contacts in a single day, each time directing coordinated attacks with astonishing accuracy. Sonar operators reported clean returns, noting shifts in depth and course. German submarines, once used to brief cat-and-mouse skirmishes, now found themselves locked under pressure for hours. U-630 attempted to escape beneath a thermal layer, a tactic that had worked in 1941, but improved sonar cut through the layer, maintaining a steady echo. Destroyer HMS Sunflower executed a flawless depth charge run, resulting in U-630's destruction. Survivors from other boats later reported that the newer Allied sonar systems felt unrelenting, mathematical, and impossible to evade. Meanwhile, Allied aircraft extended the battlefield. Long-range liberators from RAF Coastal Command tracked surfaced U-boats, forcing them to dive prematurely. This meant submarines entered sonar engagements already exhausted, with low batteries and minimal maneuvering endurance. One U-boat commander described it as fighting a battle before the real battle. As convoy ONS 5 continued westward, German losses mounted. U-638 fell to HMS Sunflower after persistent sonar contact. U-192 was sunk by an escort south of Greenland. Others sustained damage severe enough to abort their missions. The Wolf Pack, once the terror of the Atlantic, appeared disjointed, hunted, and outmaneuvered. Inside each submarine, the experience felt suffocating. Sailors pressed their ears to bulkheads, praying the pings would fade. Officers studied gauges showing dwindling reserves. Carbon dioxide levels rose. Hulls groaned under depth. Every rising ping indicated the enemy was not merely searching. They were honing in, and above them, escort ships moved with purpose. Sonar dictated every turn, every tightening of the trap. What had once been instinct or chance had become science. The escorts no longer feared the U-boats. The U-boats feared the escorts. By the time ONS-5 reached safer waters, the Germans had lost a staggering number of submarines. The surviving commanders reported a chilling reality. Allied sonar had reached a level of effectiveness that made many traditional U-boat tactics obsolete. The climax of the Atlantic War was still unfolding, but ONS-5 revealed a truth that could no longer be denied. The hunters of the deep had become the hunted. The events surrounding convoy ONS-5 did more than inflict tactical losses. They forced the German High Command to confront a profound strategic crisis. Throughout early 1943, the The Kriegsmarine had insisted that aggressive wolfpack operations could still overwhelm Allied defenses. But the unfolding pattern of engagements demonstrated something far more devastating. The underwater battlefield had been rewritten. As May 1943 progressed, the Allies intensified their offensive posture. Convoys were no longer passive columns seeking to survive. They became moving fortresses, escorted by ships equipped with advanced sonar, radar, HF/DF radio detection, and a newfound confidence that came from dozens of successful engagements. The synergy between surface ships, aircraft, and intelligence produced a layered defense system that deprived U-boats of their traditional strengths: stealth, surprise, and maneuverability. On the German side, this shift manifested in alarming intelligence reports. Donitz received message after message from returning captains who described engagements lasting not minutes, but hours. Boats reported being pinned underwater by sonar for so long that oxygen levels dropped dangerously. Batteries died mid-evasion. Carbon dioxide forced crews to the brink of unconsciousness. Machinery overheated. Men hallucinated. Food spoiled in the hot, damp air. One such report came from U-266, which survived an extended pursuit only to be sunk by a Liberator days later. The captain wrote that sonar contact never weakened and that the escorts attacked as if guided by a map of our position. Similar accounts arrived from U-386 and U-402, describing sonar beams that tracked them even below thermal layers and at the limits of safe diving depth. German officers could no longer dismiss these reports as anomalies. They were indicators of a systemic collapse. The Allies, for their part, continued refining their tactical doctrine. The Royal Navy perfected patterns such as the beta search, plaster, and creeping attack, ensuring that once sonar established contact, the chances of escape dropped dramatically. American destroyer escorts introduced Hedgehog mortars into routine operations, adding a new dimension to anti-submarine warfare. Unlike depth charges, which relied on calculated depth settings, Hedgehog projectiles exploded only upon impact, creating a silent, deadly field of explosives that rewarded precise sonar tracking. A pivotal moment came in mid-May 1943 when Donitz gathered senior staff to assess the situation. Reports indicated that in the previous 3 weeks alone, the U-boat arm had lost 41 submarines, nearly a quarter of its operational strength. The losses were not spread out over varied operations. They clustered around convoy battles, where sonar played a decisive role. Sonar contact was initiating engagements, sustaining them, and guiding the attacks that annihilated entire wolf packs. For the first time, Donitz acknowledged a grim reality. The Atlantic route could no longer be contested at will. This realization marked the climax of the U-boat war. The shift was not simply technological. It was psychological, strategic, and existential. U-boat crews, once seen as Germany's elite maritime force, now faced near-certain death each time they left port. The Allies' layered detection methods, radar at night, aircraft in daylight, sonar underwater, left submarines vulnerable across every domain. The fear inside the submarines was matched by mounting desperation in command centers. Engineers scrambled to accelerate the development of the new Type XXI Electroboot, a design meant to restore underwater superiority. But it was too late. The design was revolutionary, but production timelines stretched beyond the immediate crisis. Even if built in time, crews required months of training, and Germany lacked the stable industrial capacity required for mass deployment. Meanwhile, Allied victories accumulated. Convoys HX, 237, SC, 129, and ONS, 202 all demonstrated similar patterns: sonar contact, coordinated attack, destruction. The U-boat fleet, which had once roamed the Atlantic as a menace to Allied supply lines, now retreated from battles they had initiated. Captains received orders to avoid convoy engagements unless conditions were overwhelmingly favorable, a directive unimaginable a year earlier. The broader war also amplified the crisis. The Battle of Stalingrad had ended in catastrophe for Germany. North Africa was collapsing. The Eastern Front demanded resources at a scale the Kriegsmarine could not compete with. And in the Atlantic, Sonar ensured that every operational loss was permanent. Experienced crews gone, boats destroyed, replacements increasingly inexperienced. By late May 1943, Donitz made a historic announcement. The U-boat arm would withdraw from the North Atlantic. For the first time since the war began, German submarines ceded control of the ocean to the Allies. The withdrawal did not end the U-boat war, but it marked the moment when Germany's most feared naval weapon lost its dominance. The sonar ping, once a curiosity, had become the defining sound of defeat. The climax of the underwater conflict had unfolded not in a single explosion, but in the steady accumulation of moments where technology, coordination, and endurance overwhelmed a force that had ruled the ocean by darkness and silence. And as U-boats retreated to safer waters, the consequences of this reversal began to reshape strategy, morale, and the maritime balance of the war. The withdrawal of the U-boats from the North Atlantic did not end the war beneath the waves, but it fundamentally altered its trajectory. For the first time since 1939, Allied commanders could speak of control rather than mere survival. The psychological weight lifted from the convoy system was immense. Merchant captains who had once feared every shadow on the horizon now sailed with the knowledge that sonar-equipped escorts stood between them and the lurking danger below. The balance of initiative, so long held by the U-boats, had shifted irreversibly. In the weeks following May 1943, the Kriegsmarine analyzed the staggering losses. Veteran crews, those who had survived the early, more manageable years, were gone. New submariners, many barely out of training, faced a battlefield that bore no resemblance to the doctrine they had studied. They sailed into a world where sonar was mature, escorts were coordinated, and Allied air patrols were relentless. Even before engaging a convoy, many boats were forced underwater by aircraft, entering battles fatigued, short on oxygen, and unable to remain submerged for extended periods. As reports filtered back to German command centers, a grim picture emerged. U-boat morale had not simply declined, it had fractured. Survivors describe an atmosphere of fatalism. The once proud submarine arm, celebrated in Nazi propaganda as a decisive force, now understood that its opponents wielded tools that science and industry would not allow Germany to match quickly enough. Letters from sailors, where censors permitted, carried a subdued tone, acknowledging the rising casualty numbers and the grim odds of return. Allied forces, meanwhile, capitalized on their advantage. Escort groups standardized their tactics, integrating lessons learned from convoy battles of early 1943. Training intensified. Sonar operators became experts at interpreting faint echoes, understanding acoustic distortions, and coordinating attack patterns with surface vessels. Naval manuals were rewritten to incorporate the success of creeping attacks, hedgehog barges, and layered search grids. The improvement was not merely tactical, it was institutional. British and American naval schools emphasized anti-submarine warfare with renewed urgency. Exercises simulated real U-boat evasions. Operators practiced for hours in darkened rooms, learning how sound traveled through cold water, warm water, turbulent seas, and layered thermoclines. Naval engineers studied hydrophones, propeller cavitation, and hull reflection patterns to refine sonar sensitivity. The result was a generation of sailors who understood the underwater battlefield with unprecedented clarity. On the German side, attempts to address the crisis were constrained by industrial limitations. Designs for improved U-boats, including the Type XXI and Type XXII, promised longer submerged endurance, faster underwater speeds, and reduced acoustic signatures. Yet these advanced submarines demanded resources, precision engineering, and stable manufacturing conditions, luxuries the collapsing German war economy could not guarantee. Even optimistic projections suggested these boats would not enter service in meaningful numbers until late 1944 or 1945, far too late to reverse the situation in the Atlantic. The fear that sonar created inside each U-boat also had long-term consequences. Crews described symptoms today recognized as psychological trauma, persistent anxiety, nightmares, and heightened sensitivity to sudden sounds. Some veterans later recalled that, even decades after the war, the memory of a sonar ping could tighten their chest and quicken their heartbeat. The sound had become not just a tactical threat, but an emotional imprint, an echo that followed them long after the ocean had grown quiet. As Allied convoys continued sailing with fewer losses, the strategic implications became clear. Britain's supply lines stabilized. The flow of American troops, equipment, and fuel into the European theater increased exponentially. The long-feared blockade scenario, the one that nearly crippled Britain in 1917 and threatened to repeat itself in 1941, had been permanently averted. The aftermath of the turning point in 1943 was therefore more than a shift in tactics. It was the beginning of a new phase in the war, one in which German submarines could no longer dictate the tempo of the Atlantic, and Allied technology had finally achieved the supremacy it needed. But the consequences were not limited to strategy and logistics. They extended into the emotional and operational core of the U-boat arm, shaping the experiences of thousands of men who entered the ocean knowing that the next ping might be their last. The deeper consequences of the sonar revolution rippled across the remainder of the war. What occurred in 1943 was not an isolated improvement. It was the establishment of a permanent technological edge that Germany could no longer challenge. In the months following the withdrawal from the North Atlantic, Allied anti-submarine warfare refined itself into a comprehensive system that touched every corner of the ocean. Long-range aircraft patrolled routes once considered unreachable. Escort carriers, small, agile ships carrying only a handful of aircraft, extended air coverage even further, projecting reconnaissance and attack capability across thousands of miles. Sonar-equipped destroyers operated in groups that rotated seamlessly, ensuring that convoys always had fresh, alert crews ready for action. The Mid-Atlantic, once a graveyard of merchant ships, transformed into a guarded highway. German U-boats attempted to adapt. They altered patrol zones, shifting operations to the Bay of Biscay, the Arctic routes, and the waters off West Africa. But nowhere did they regain the dominance they once held. Wherever they surfaced, Allied intelligence, radar, and sonar intersected to reveal their presence. Even the Bay of Biscay, once a safe transit zone, became a dangerous bottleneck patrolled by aircraft and fast attack craft. For many crews, the journey from port to open ocean became as perilous as combat itself. Meanwhile, the Allies saw the fruits of uninterrupted supply lines. American troops and equipment poured into Europe in preparation for major operations. Lend-Lease shipments to Britain and the Soviet Union increased dramatically. Fuel, steel, machinery, and food crossed the Atlantic in record volumes. The logistical backbone that enabled campaigns in Italy, Normandy, and beyond rested on a foundation secured during the transformation of the Atlantic War. For Germany, the inability to counter sonar had long-term strategic implications. Donitz continued to pressure industry to deliver the advanced-type XXI submarines, which he believed could restore underwater superiority. These Electroboot were capable of high underwater speeds and extended submerged operation, designs meant to negate sonar by relying on stealth and endurance. Yet delays plagued the program. Allied bombing disrupted production. Skilled labor shortages slowed assembly. Technical defects emerged from rushed construction. By the time the first Type XXI boats reached operational readiness, the war was already collapsing around Germany on multiple fronts. In the final years of the conflict, U-boat crews increasingly consisted of inexperienced recruits commanded by officers who understood the fatal mathematics of their missions. Loss rates remained staggering. In 1944 alone, Germany lost more than 200 submarines. Many never fired a torpedo. Others were sunk before reaching patrol zones. The U-boat arm, once a symbol of strategic innovation, had become a force defined by sacrifice rather than accomplishment. Yet, even in defeat, the legacy of sonar shaped the post-war world. Allied navies adopted sonar as the cornerstone of submarine detection, influencing Cold War strategies, ship design, and training programs for decades. Submarines evolved as well. Faster, quieter, deeper diving. But the principle remained. Underwater warfare would forever be a contest between concealment and detection. For the men who survived the U-boat service, the emotional aftermath lingered long after the surrender. Veterans spoke of the oppressive silence inside a submarine, the metallic echo of sonar pings that once signaled imminent death. Some recalled the faces of crewmates frozen in dim red light as they listened for the next return pulse. Others remembered the relief, almost overwhelming, when the pings finally stopped and the ocean fell quiet again. These memories shaped the identity of an entire generation of submariners who served in a force that transitioned from triumph to tragedy in only a few years. By the end of the war, the numbers told the story starkly. Of the roughly 40,000 men who served in German U-boats, more than 30,000 did not return. The highest casualty rate of any major branch of any service in World War II. The sonar ping, cold, methodical, and precise, had become the sound of that devastating statistic. And as the conflict moved toward its final chapters, the meaning of the underwater war grew clearer. Germany's defeat in the Atlantic was not simply the loss of ships, but the collapse of a naval doctrine outpaced by scientific progress. The ocean, once a realm of shadows and opportunity for U-boat crews, had become an arena illuminated by sound, an arena where silence could no longer guarantee survival. In the quiet aftermath of the Atlantic War, long after convoys had completed their final crossings and the great submarine pens of France stood abandoned, a single truth remained. The Battle of the Atlantic was not won solely by firepower, bravery, or sheer endurance. It was won by the subtle mastery of sound. The sonar ping, clean, metallic, unwavering, became the symbol of a fundamental shift in warfare. It marked the moment when the ocean, once ruled by silence and stealth, opened itself to detection. For decades, submarines had relied on darkness, depth, and the vastness of the sea to conceal their presence. Sonar stripped away those advantages. It revealed shape, motion, and intent in a medium once considered impenetrable. Yet the deeper significance of this transformation goes beyond tactics or technology. It lies in what the men who fought beneath the waves experienced. For German U-boat crews, the ping was not just a tool of the enemy. It was a reminder of vulnerability. A reminder that no matter how carefully they navigated, how quietly they moved, or how bravely they fought, the ocean no longer offered the sanctuary it once had. Their struggle, once defined by stealth and initiative, became a battle against time, pressure, and the growing reach of science. For Allied sailors and airmen, sonar represented hope, a way to protect the lifeline that kept nations alive. It allowed them to transform fear into control, uncertainty into coordination, and scattered defenses into a unified force that reshaped the war. Today, the lessons endure. Underwater warfare continues to evolve, but the central tension remains the same: the contest between what hides and what seeks to uncover it. The Battle of the Atlantic showed that innovation can alter not just tactics, but the psychology and fate of those who serve. And in the long arc of history, the sonar ping remains one of the most consequential sounds ever heard, a sound that echoed through steel hulls, across command rooms, and ultimately through the outcome of a global conflict.